People look at daily market data, the rapid price swings and sudden crashes, and they see chaos. The economy appears as an unpredictable force of nature. But underneath that day-to-day volatility, the economy is a deterministic, mechanical system. It is governed by a few simple parts, repeated millions of times, driven entirely by predictable human behavior and the mechanics of credit. This visualization strips away the noise to reveal the three forces driving the machine. First, the steady upward line of long-term productivity growth. Second, the rapid oscillations of the short-term debt cycle. And third, the sweeping, low-frequency wave of the long-term debt cycle. By laying these three waveforms on top of each other, we can build the macroeconomic machine from first principles. We can trace exactly how growth is synthesized, why severe market crashes are mathematically inevitable, and the precise mechanics required to engineer a recovery. Treating the global economy as a precisely engineered machine provides a template for tracking these movements. By identifying where we sit within each of these three cycles, we can begin to see the specific mechanics of a coming crisis, while others see only noise. Every macro cycle originates from a single building block, the transaction. An economy is simply the aggregate sum of a buyer exchanging money or credit with a seller for goods, services, or financial assets. When you make a basic transaction using cash, the exchange instantly settles. The buyer gets the goods, the seller gets the money, and the interaction is permanently complete. Credit operates under a different set of rules. While cash settles a transaction immediately, credit defers that settlement to a future date. When two parties agree to credit, they synthesize opposing forces out of thin air. The borrower promises to pay, creating a liability. The lender receives that promise, creating an asset. This matters because of the absolute rule of macrodynamics. Every dollar you spend is a dollar someone else earns. One entity's spending is another entity's income. Injecting credit into this system creates a self-reinforcing feedback loop. Increased credit allows higher spending. That extra spending becomes extra income, boosting their creditworthiness. They can borrow even more, multiplying outward and lighting up the network. Credit is a temporal mechanism. It pulls future consumption forward. To buy something you cannot afford today, you must spend less than you make tomorrow, mechanically guaranteeing a future economic contraction when that liability must eventually be settled. In an economy operating entirely without credit, the only way to increase your spending is to produce more. System growth is strictly capped by linear, accumulated gains in productivity. This timeline introduces our first level of volatility. Because credit allows our consumption to temporarily outpace physical production, it creates the oscillations of the short-term debt cycle. As spending expands faster than production, prices rise, causing inflation. To prevent this, the system relies on the central bank. Seeing prices climb, it turns up the interest rate dial, making borrowing expensive and increasing costs on existing liabilities. This triggers a downward cascade. With higher debt servicing requirements, businesses have less money to spend. System-wide incomes drop, prices fall, creating deflation, and a recession begins. Once the contraction becomes too severe, the central bank lowers the interest rate. This reduces debt repayments, stimulates new borrowing, and restarts the expansion, repeating this rhythm every 5 to 8 years. The short-term debt cycle generates the standard booms and recessions we experience every decade. These oscillations are a direct mechanical consequence of the central bank manipulating the interest rate lever. Yet there is a systemic vulnerability hidden within these high-frequency waves. Human nature dictates an asymmetric preference. During economic expansions, people eagerly take on new debt rather than paying down their old obligations. This 100-year chart reveals how this behavior compounds over decades. At the end of each short-term cycle, absolute debt levels grow faster than incomes. This continual expansion inflates asset values and builds a massive macro bubble. Eventually, this supercycle hits a strict mathematical limit. The total debt burden becomes so massive that debt repayments structurally outpace income growth. At this peak, a catastrophic cascade occurs. Borrowers are squeezed. Credit dries up instantly. Desperate to fill the hole, borrowers are forced into mass liquidations, flooding the market and crashing asset prices. This exact peak in the long-term cycle is responsible for the most devastating economic crashes in modern history. the system enters a deleveraging. This is distinctly different from a standard recession because the primary regulatory mechanism fails completely. The central bank cannot save the economy. To stimulate borrowing, they slash interest rates, but those rates quickly hit the absolute floor. The dial locks at 0%, rendering traditional policy entirely powerless to stimulate new credit. A deleveraging represents a total systemic paralysis. With traditional monetary policy rendered useless, the system requires an entirely different set of engineered solutions to prevent a total economic collapse. To restart the paralyzed system, policymakers must force the aggregate debt-to-income burden to contract. They are left with 4 highly sensitive, high-risk levers. These 4 levers are austerity, defaults and restructuring, wealth redistribution, and printing money. The first 2 levers force harsh contractions. Austerity mandates severe cuts in spending. Defaults break existing debt contracts. Because one person's debt is another's asset, wiping out liabilities directly destroys perceived wealth. This creates the paradox of austerity. Cutting spending destroys incomes. Because incomes fall faster than old debts are repaid, the debt burden mathematically worsens, triggering severe deflationary pressure. Policymakers then turn to the third lever, the redistribution of wealth. Facing a collapsed tax base and soaring unemployment, the central government raises taxes on the wealthy to fund stimulus for the poor, creating severe socioeconomic friction. If the deflationary depression continues, this friction breeds deep resentment. Historically, this exact economic desperation leads directly to extreme political change and severe social disorder. With the zero lower bound hit and tensions escalating, the central bank is forced to use the fourth lever, synthesizing new fiat currency out of thin air to aggressively purchase financial assets and government bonds. This is the only stimulative lever available. It directly injects liquidity into the system, adding an inflationary weight to counteract the total collapse of credit. Exiting in depression is an incredibly delicate, highly volatile engineering problem. Pull the deflationary levers too hard, and the economy spirals into a death trap. Pull the inflationary lever too hard, and you risk destroying the currency completely. Over-relying on the printing press carries severe risks. Synthesizing too much fiat easily triggers hyperinflation, completely destroying the currency's value, as seen historically in Germany during the 1920s. A beautiful deleveraging occurs when policymakers manage to offset the crushing deflationary forces of debt reduction with an equivalent amount of inflationary stimulus. Growth is slow, but debt-to-income ratios decline without triggering a total social or currency collapse. This chart reveals the precise mathematical equation required to clear the debt cycle. The rate of nominal income growth must be engineered to sit strictly above the rate of interest on the accumulated debt. Operating this machine successfully requires adhering to 3 fundamental engineering constraints for long-term stability. First, do not let your debt rise faster than your income, or the debt burdens will eventually crush you. Second, do not let your income rise faster than your productivity, or you will eventually become uncompetitive. And third, optimize for long-term productivity above all else. The economy is a mechanical system with definable limits. By mastering its inputs and respecting its constraints, both individuals and policymakers can engineer their survival through its most devastating cycles.